Resolution all time is yielded for the purposes of debate only, and I would like to yield the customary 30 minutes to my friend Mr. McGovern from Massachusetts, pending which I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Without objection, and the gentleman from Georgia is recognized for as much time as he wishes to consume.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd also like to ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I found myself listening to the reading clerk as he read through the rule. It's a fairly straightforward rule, but it sounded pretty complicated as he was going through it. And I am reminded that standing to your left is one of the gentlemen that helps us sort through those issues. As every member of this institution knows who was listening to the colloquy last week, Brian Cooper is leaving this House after 35 years of public service, honorable service, showing up day in and day out. My friend Mr. McGovern and I working on the Rules Committee. We sometimes go into 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. Well, folks like Mr. Cooper can't go home until the Rules Committee goes home. So day in and day out with absolutely no pomp or circumstance, just dedicated public service, Brian Cooper served this institution, and I fear this will be the last time he and I are on the floor together while I have control of a microphone. And I did not want to yield control of that microphone without telling him how much his assistance has meant to me. You know, Mr. Speaker, standing in that chair is a powerful responsibility. The burden sometimes is a lot to bear when you're surrounded by a team of excellence as you are today with Ethan to your right and Brian to your left. I know you do that with great confidence, and I'm grateful to folks who help us to succeed. Thank you, Mr. Cooper, for all of that service. Mr. Speaker, House Resolution 348 is a structured rule, and it provides for consideration of H.R. 953. It's the Reducing Regulatory Burdens of 2017 Act. And it makes in order 2 amendments, both from my Democratic colleagues, one from Ms. Esty and one from Mr. Hustman. As you might remember, the House passed a nearly identical version of this bill last year, Mr. Speaker, but unfortunately it did not get across the finish line in the Senate, so it did not make it to the President's desk. We're trying again this year. My sincere hope is that we will succeed. Mr. Speaker, I know that you hear from constituents, as I do, talking about regulatory burdens and why can't we bring common sense rules and regulation to Washington. H.R. 953, the bill that this rule would make in order, is an attempt to do that. The bill prohibits EPA from requiring unnecessary and duplicative pollution permits for certain pesticides. Now, so often when we start a sentence with "this prevents EPA," Mr. Speaker, folks think, oh, there goes those Republicans again, going after the environment, waiving those regulations that protect friends and family. Well, as you know, Mr. Speaker, that accusation is never accurate, but in particular, it fails to address this situation. For decade upon decade, the EPA has regulated pesticides in this country. And if we pass H.R. 953 today, for decade and decade to come, EPA will continue to regulate pesticides in this country. But as the result of litigation, Mr. Speaker, the courts are forcing EPA not to regulate pesticides as pesticides, but to regulate pesticides as pollutant discharges, as if there is something else to do with pesticide other than to spray it. They're saying you can't just get a permit to use your pesticide, Mr. Speaker. You can't just read the label and the proper application and get a permit to apply as indicated on the label. You must also get a permit to discharge a pollutant as if the pesticide is not already regulated as a pesticide itself. Mr. Speaker, it makes no sense. And the good news is I'm surrounded by a team of excellence here in the United States House of Representatives, and in a bipartisan way, we've already agreed that it makes no sense. You'll recall, Mr. Speaker, we brought a substantially similar measure to the floor. We passed it under a process called suspension of the rules. It's a process we save for those bills that are relatively non-controversial. It passed in a bipartisan way, but didn't make it across the Senate floor. We brought it back again, Mr. Speaker, to this floor. We brought it under a rule, as we're doing today, passed again in a bipartisan way. Senate to the Senate, couldn't make it across the Senate floor. Mr. Speaker, we added it to the farm bill that we passed here in the House, which again passed in a bipartisan way. Sent it over to the Senate. It was stripped out on the Senate side. Mr. Speaker, we have come together time and time again as a body to move this common sense regulatory reform forward. And it's my great hope that I'll get support from both sides of the aisle again today, not just on this rule, but on the underlying legislation, and we'll move forward in a bipartisan way again. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Georgia.